Me and Joe gasped for breath as he rushed us down the street, neither of us sure of what to say next. Despite it just happening, it all seemed so unreal, almost a dream. Finally, Joe turned to look at me, eyes deep set in their sockets. "Are you alright?" he asked. I started to nod, but then thought about it and shook my head no instead. "Not really. Are you?" He shook his head as well, and for a minute longer we continued to drive in silence. I didn't even know where we were going, and I didn't ask. I noted with some trepidation that the road seemed particularly clear for this time of day, but once again I said nothing. I wondered if I would ever speak again. Joe spoke up, voice heavy. "That thing. We have seen it before, or at least something similar. Do you think it was targeting us, specifically?" A fair question. Slowly I thought back to it, that moment that had just happened mere minutes ago but seemed to be a lifetime away. I tried to disconnect myself from the incident, to think of it only as an impartial third party. I tried to ignore the hundreds of red hands, the moaning and wailing of it, the way it ripped off a car roof like it was nothing. I tried to ignore all of that. I tried. But past all of that, I thought of its behavior, of the way it acted, how it moved, who it targeted. And slowly, the thought came to me. "No," I said. "No. It was just grabbing anyone it could. The little girl, the guy in the car, the people before it saw us. We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Joe nodded in affirmation and then spoke. "Yeah, wrong place at the wrong time. Both of us happened to have a run in with these things, and then it happened to attack the hospital we were staying at. A lot of coincidences if we weren't being targeted. Either that or it's happening everywhere." He once again looked at me, worry and fear in his eyes. "Turn on the radio." I complied, reaching over and fiddling with the knobs. For a moment, there was nothing but a brief burst of static, which made both me and Joe flinch, but then a voice broke through, wild and very unprofessional sounding. "We continue to bring you live updates of these strange creatures' attacks that seem to have started around last night. We must once again urge everyone to stay indoors and keep your windows and doors locked as we attempt to figure out what is going on and what plans the government has in store for us. If you are just tuning in, the United States government has issued a nationwide alert and orders to remain calm. There have been reports from all over the country and overseas of strange creatures emerging and attacking people, with reports on what they are doing afterwards being unclear, but the attacks most often result in them either dragging people back with them to wherever it is they came from, or, horribly, devouring them whole. Small arms fire seems to be completely ineffectual against them, and while larger arms have seen small degrees of success, we still must insist that you attempt to avoid any interaction with these creatures at all costs. Stay indoors and keep your windows and doors locked." The radio continued on like this, and I reached over and turned it down, making sure that we could still hear it while we talked. "So, it's everywhere," I said simply, and Joe nodded in grim satisfaction. I didn't want to believe it, but the coincidences were starting to pile up. These things are kidnapping people all over the continent, hell, all over the world, and nobody has any idea why. He suddenly slammed his hand into the steering wheel, startling me a little, but I understood completely. There is nothing more frustrating than having zero clue what was going on. I looked out the window, thinking to myself, before glancing back and realizing what I was looking at. "Joe," I said, "look." I pointed out the window on my side, and when he turned to peer at what I saw, he blanched. There was a field on my side, and standing in the middle of it was a creature that had to be at least 30 feet tall. It stood on 4 giant legs, tall and spindly, all of them connected to a large, head-like blob at the top with a single, massive eye square in the center of it. From its legs there emerged smaller tentacles all around them that constantly searched around it, grabbing at anything they could. From the back of it, on the opposite side of where the eye resided, it had a long tube running from it, as all these creatures seemed to, connecting back to the ground and going into a massive pit in the middle of the field. Me and Joe stared at it as it slowly made its way to the neighborhood on the other side of the field, scanning the houses with its horrible eyeball. Seeing something, it lifted a leg with frightening speed for something so big, slamming it down on the other side of a building where we could not see. As we watched, we could see a person being raised up the leg, carried by the tentacles that sprouted from it as they passed him upward, like a game of relay. Once he reached the top, a mouth that had to be the size of a small car opened on the bottom of it and consumed the person whole, sliding him inside with the ease of a man eating a grape. Very faintly, we could hear his screams. Afterwards, the behemoth continued to move, its eye like a spotlight, searching for any more people that were unfortunate enough to get caught in its gaze. Something managed to pull my attention from that thing for a brief moment, and I glanced out the windshield to see we were rapidly approaching a guardrail. We had been so distracted by that monstrously large nightmare that Joe had started to veer, and if we didn't adjust now, we would crash. "Joe! Look out!" I yelled, and he looked back, eyes widening as he realized what was happening. He managed to yank the car back onto the road just in time, narrowly avoiding a crash, and we both sighed in relief as we looked at each other, the relief quickly fading from our faces. "What the fuck?" Joe whispered, and all I could do was nod in agreement. This was far, far bigger than either of us could have anticipated. I glanced back at the monster, still easily visible over the tree line, and swallowed hard. My mouth was dry and I felt like I was drifting further and further away, and I knew that if I wasn't careful I was going to lose myself to the panic. Concentrate. 30 seconds of panic, but no more. Breathe. That was horrifying. That was for sure. But breaking down in tears over it would do me no good. Worse, it may get me killed. Slowly, I collected myself, pulling all those broken little pieces together as I tried to make sense of it all, or at the very least, put it together enough that I was able to keep going. If I had to pack it all up and store it away somewhere deep inside of me, then that was fine. I could deal with this later. I needed to be in the here and now, or there would be no later to deal with it. I snapped my eyes open, letting the coolness flow through me. Fire would just get you burned. "Joe," I snapped, speaking fast. "Where are we going? Do you have any particular destination in mind?" Joe looked at me, blinking slowly. I had a distinct feeling he was also not in the best mental state right now. No, I guess not. Once we got away from the hospital, I've just been driving, hoping to get away from all this madness," he said, gesturing to the massive thing behind us, which was mercifully getting smaller as we drove further away. "Do you have any idea on where to go?" I nodded. "The doctor. Saul. We might as well check out the closer one, see if we can glean any information from him. If he's the wrong one, then I guess it's going to be a pretty difficult drive to the other Saul. Do you know where we are?" Joe nodded, looking a little more focused now that we had a clear plan in mind. "Yeah, I actually used to live near this neighborhood as a kid, though I never actually went into Bethel Street. More of an upper-class place, no room for a troublemaker like me. It's only about a half-hour away." He turned off the highway, presumably heading to said neighborhood, and I decided to take this time to further collect myself, closing my eyes and trying not to focus on the rapidly collapsing world around me. Several minutes passed this way, and I almost didn't notice the change at first. It was so subtle. But as time went on, it got more and more overwhelming, and I was forced to open my eyes and look around for the source in an almost panic, knowing what that smell meant. Thankfully, there was nothing around but us and the semi-empty roads, with just the occasional panicked driver attempting to make their way out of the city as they whizzed past us, daring to brave the streets. I looked at Joe and he nodded, confirming what I already knew. Chocolate, and cake, and popcorn. I smell it too, he said, face seeming to remain calm, but eyes darting around. But that means that one of those things is nearby. We need to be careful, I said, reaching for my gun before realizing that it was still at my house. Damn it! Joe, after we get this doctor to talk, we have to stop by my place to grab my gun. He nodded and glanced out the window again, but still there was nothing. Mary, what if there isn't one of those things near us? What if it just smells like this everywhere now? He said slowly, clearly not liking the implications of that thought, but still needing to say it anyway. Then I guess things really have gone to shit, Joe. Can I have your gun? I said, to which he laughed out loud suddenly, surprising me. I didn't mean it as a joke. Ha! No, Mary, no you cannot. We're here, he said, still chuckling slightly. We pulled up into the driveway of a small, unassuming suburban house with 28 painted onto its mailbox. I glanced around, but didn't see any creatures, despite the smell of cookies being so strong I could almost taste them. It was so strong, in fact, that I could once again smell the salt underneath it, a strange detail that was slowly driving me mad by how out of place it seemed. I didn't know if I wanted Joe's hypothesis on everything smelling like this now to be true or not, because on one hand, it would mean that something was not directly on top of us like it seemed to be, but on the other hand, it meant that these things were so prevalent now that there was no more getting a forewarning, one of the few small boons we had. Joe got out of the car, glancing around to make sure there was nothing, but only a gentle breeze greeted him. In the distance, we could hear sirens, but here there was nothing but the wind. I got out too, shivering a bit from the cold. Autumn was coming. We walked up to the house, staring at the front door, which was extraordinarily plain looking. I glanced at Joe, and he glanced at me before reaching out and knocking. Unsurprisingly, nobody answered. Really? I said, and he just gave a small smile before trying the doorknob, shocked to see that it opened easily. Maybe he just forgot to lock it, I whispered, and now it was Joe's turn to give me a funny look. That did seem rather unlikely, given the larger circumstances. I peeked inside, seeing nothing but a dark foyer and hallway before stepping through, Joe following close behind, hand on his gun. He made sure to close the door behind him, not wanting any sudden surprises from the back when we could very easily be dealing with one from the front. Inside was quiet, except for an odd buzzing noise with no discernible source. The place had that oppressive atmosphere that all houses have when you're inside of them without being invited. There was no movement, and the only light came from the slowly setting sun in the windows, which gave everything an orange-red tint. I walked in a couple more steps before suddenly being hit by the smell, which instantly overwhelmed the scent of desserts I was already becoming accustomed to. Rot. Something I was, unfortunately, already pretty used to. Joe moved forward, peering into each room on the right while I followed him, checking the ones on the left. I didn't find anything particularly useful, but I did note that the occupant lived rather sparsely, with a mostly bare house except for the occasional odd-looking statue. An art man, perhaps. Mary! I heard Joe yell from the other side of the house, and I could tell from his voice what I already suspected. I don't think we're going to be able to ask Dr. Saul many questions. I walked over to where his voice was coming from, leg twingling but ignoring it, as I passed a small statue of a man with goat horns. The smell was overwhelming now, and the buzzing was louder than ever as I saw Joe standing in front of a doorway, holding a single sheet of paper. It's pretty nasty in there. I don't know if you want to look, he told me, gesturing to the room, but he knew that I would look, just as I knew. I walked past him and stood in the door frame, the smell of the decaying flesh nearly choking me now. In the red and orange of the sunset, the body of who I assumed was Dr. Saul hung limply from the ceiling, skin slowly falling off of him. The noose hung tight, and I could barely make out his face amongst the flies that were now covering him. They were the source of the buzzing noise. I grimaced and stepped out, gesturing for Joe to follow me back to the front of the house. I would have gone outside, but I didn't really want to leave us exposed as we talked, and I could count on the dead body to not try to attack us. Probably. I found this in the room with him. His suicide note, Joe said, handing it to me. The handwriting was messy, and it was short, only a paragraph long. I have done terrible things, and worse things are going to happen, because of me. I'm sorry. I can only hope that one day I will find the peace and acceptance that she promised me, a promise I now know to be a lie. Eve, if you are reading this, know that I hope your Eden will crumble, and that you are there to crumble with it. This idea of yours will never work. For everyone else, I'm sorry. I really am. I only wanted to help people, and now, because of me, everyone will suffer. I'm a coward. I'm sorry. I looked on the back of it, but that was all there was. So, I guess this was the guy. This Eve woman was the same person who wrote the memo you found. He had something to do with all of this, and he couldn't bear the shame. I glanced back at the room where he still lay, forever staring at the wall, and tried to feel something. But really, the only thing I felt was tired. It was all so much, and now we had nothing to go off of. It was a dead end. Joe took the paper from me, and I let him, staring at the window at the nearly set sun. The stars were starting to come out, and I wanted to get a good look at them. I seem to be looking at the stars a lot lately. What do we do now, Joe? I said, leaning against the cool glass. That was our only lead, and now he's dead. Do we just sit back and watch the world end? I stared out into the street, waiting to see a monster with a million screaming faces come shambling down it, or something equally as horrifying. It wouldn't even surprise me at this point. I wouldn't be so sure we have lost our lead, Mary. I think the doctor told us something with this note, Joe said, and I managed to pull myself off of the glass, turning to look at him. What? He pointed at a sentence on it, eyebrow raised. I hope your Eden will crumble. That's not a figure of speech. Eden is a tiny little ocean town, about a day's drive from here. I bet if we go there, we'll find the source of all this madness. He gave me a wary smile, pointing down the street. If I remember correctly, and I think I do, it's that way. I peered out the window, looking down the street as the stars finally started to come out, joining the almost full moon and casting a dim glow on the scene. Do you really think that's what he meant? I asked Joe, not sure what to think. He shrugged. Maybe. Do you have a better idea? I looked down the street that he was pointing to again, seeing a bright, twinkling star appear over it. It almost seemed to call to me, to tell me that this was the way to go. This was the way forward, it said. This is where you need to go. No, Joe, I don't. Looks like we're heading to Eden.